A sea of voices. Thousands of people sing every word. Guitars roll across an open festival field. Teenagers wearing brand new battle jackets stand beside fans who've been making the pilgrimage for 40 years. They don't share the same age or the same country. Or even the same favorite band. Yet somehow, they all speak the same musical language. A language so familiar, we rarely stop to ask where it came from. Beneath all of heavy metal's success lies a story that almost disappeared. Not the story of one band, but of a movement. History has a habit of remembering destinations. It isn't always as kind to the roads that led there. We celebrate the bands that conquered the world. Far fewer people remember the clubs where they learned to survive, the record shops that took a chance, the journalists who insisted they mattered, or the musicians whose ideas quietly echoed through generations that followed. So what really happened? Did this movement simply burn out? Or did something stranger happen? To answer that question, we have to return to a very different Britain. Factories were falling silent, communities were changing, and while much of the music industry searched for tomorrow somewhere else, something unexpected was beginning in rehearsal rooms.
Let's go now. I tell that bloke to shut his trap, and let's do a number now called Black Sabbath. Thank you.
In small clubs, in record shops, and industrial towns where a handful of young musicians refused to believe that heavy music had already said everything that it had to say. Before anyone changed heavy metal, someone first had to believe it was worth saving. Britain, the late 1970s. Not the Britain on postcards, but the Britain millions of people knew. Factories that had defined entire towns slowed to a crawl. Some had already fallen silent. Shift whistles disappeared. Storefronts emptied. For many young people, the future no longer felt certain.
Go on rising. When Britain's teenagers left school and tried to find their first jobs, they discovered that no one wanted them.
The country wasn't standing still. It was searching for what came next. Music reflected the same uncertainty. The first generation of hard rock giants had become larger than life. Some were changing, some were fading, some belonged to another era altogether. The industry searched for the next commercial success. But it wasn't looking here. Outside the spotlight, in Birmingham, Sheffield, Newcastle, and dozens of towns that rarely appeared in music magazines, something was beginning. Not because anyone planned it, because people kept showing up. Friends gathered in rehearsal rooms. Promoters gambled on unknown bands. Independent record shops cleared space for homemade singles. Fans traded names long before anyone else cared. At first, none of it looked important. It looked scattered, small, easy to overlook. But history rarely announces itself. If you had walked into the right club on the right Friday night, you wouldn't have believed you were witnessing the beginning of anything. You would have seen another loud band playing as though the future depended on it. In a way, it did. Across Britain, people who had never met were quietly solving the problem. None of them realized they had already become part of the same story. Nobody called it a movement. There was no manifesto, no headquarters, no grand plan, only bands. Some rehearsed after factory shifts. Some borrowed equipment they couldn't afford. Some packed borrowed vans and hoped enough people showed up to pay for the petrol home. Weekends became rituals. Community halls, backroom pubs, tiny clubs between ordinary streets. If you wanted to hear something new, you had to go looking for it. A handwritten flyer.
Outside in Wardour Street, though, the fans are less than delirious. They have queued for over an hour, only to find that the club is already packed.
A friend's recommendation. A review buried in a local paper. The established music industry wasn't discovering these bands. They were discovering each other. A record shop owner heard about a group 2 cities away. A promoter booked an unknown support act. Someone carried home a self-financed single pressed in only a few hundred copies. That record moved from hand to hand, town to town, and band to band.
Very hard work and a lot of persistence to change the whole situation around. These days, as you're well aware, we run 5 nights a week, hard rock, and soul's gone straight out the door. That way, sideways.
Until another guitarist heard something. And decided to play just a little faster. Or louder. Or heavier. Nobody asked for permission. Nobody waited for approval. The scene grew because people kept adding something. The musicians, the fans, the promoters and photographers, shop owners, writers, each solved a small problem. Together, they built something none of them could have created alone. If you had asked almost anyone involved what they were part of, they probably wouldn't have known. They weren't trying to start a revolution. They were just trying to find somewhere to play next Friday. Yet invisible threads were beginning to connect cities that had never shared a stage. The same records, the same flyers, the same names. Scattered sparks finding one another. And before long, someone outside those clubs would finally give the phenomenon a name.
Gonna get on down! Welcome, your very own Iron Maiden, come on!
Names began traveling farther than the bands themselves. A single released in one city reached another. A packed club became another booking. One enthusiastic review opened another door. What had once felt isolated no longer was. There was never a single night when everything changed. There was no switch, no announcement. Real revolutions rarely arrive that way. They gather quietly until suddenly they seem to be everywhere. Independent labels backed records that major companies ignored. Photocopied fanzines found loyal readers. Record shops became meeting places as much as business. And within the music press, a pattern emerged. Bands from different cities, different backgrounds, different sounds, all arriving at nearly the same moment. Not because they copied one another, because they answered the same moment in history. Eventually, the movement acquired a name. The New Wave of British heavy metal. Not a manifesto, not an organization, simply a way to describe something impossible to ignore. Bands that once struggled to fill neighborhood clubs suddenly found larger audiences. Iron Maiden, Saxon, Def Leppard, Diamond Head, Angel Witch, Venom, Tigers of Pantang. Each sounded different, but together, they suggested something much larger was happening. The crowds grew, the records sold, tours reached farther from home. What had spread through word of mouth could no longer remain underground. The industry, after years of looking elsewhere, finally looked down and saw opportunity for musicians. It felt like validation. For record companies, it looked like a market. At first, those seemed like the same thing, but they weren't. For years, getting noticed had been the dream, but now it was happening. Phones that had never rung began to ring. Record executives appeared in clubs they had ignored for years. Bands accustomed to borrow amplifiers and crowded vans suddenly found themselves sitting across conference tables. The underground had done what few believed possible. It had forced the industry to pay attention. Opportunity arrived with promises. Better studios, wider distribution, national tours, international audiences. For musicians who had spent years scraping together enough money to press a single, those opportunities weren't easy to refuse. Nor should they have been. This was exactly what many had worked toward. Almost overnight, the landscape began to change. Shows became larger, albums became more polished. The budgets increased. Expectations increased with them. Music that had been built inside rehearsal rooms and neighborhood clubs was suddenly expected to compete on a world stage. Success opened doors, but it also introduced pressures no one had faced before. Not every band walked through those doors the same way, 'cause some adapted effortlessly. Some found audiences larger than they could have ever imagined. Others struggled to recognize the world they had fought so hard to reach. The movement had never been one sound. Now it began pulling in different directions. There was another irony. As the biggest bands grew larger, the scene that produced them became harder to see. Magazine covers celebrated stars. Television followed headline acts. Record companies searched for the next breakthrough. The spotlight narrowed, even while the community that created it continued to grow. From the outside, heavy metal had finally arrived. From the inside, the rules had quietly changed. Success changes the questions. For years, the challenge had been simple. How do you get people to listen? Now another question replaced it. How do you stay there? The change arrived quietly. A club that once booked unknown bands suddenly preferred established names. A label searched for another commercial success instead of another original voice. Magazine covers featured fewer unfamiliar faces. Little by little, the space that had allowed so many bands to grow became harder to find. The movement had always been larger than its biggest names. That had been its strength. It has also become its vulnerability. For every band stepping onto an international stage, dozens remained where they had always been, still loading their own equipment, still hoping the next record or the next tour might finally change everything. Some kept going. Some disappeared almost as quietly as they had arrived. Not because they lacked talent, not because they stopped believing. Sometimes, history simply moves faster than the people trying to make it. Diamond Head became one of those stories. Their songs would inspire musicians who eventually sold millions of records. Metallica would openly celebrate their influence, covering their songs, crediting them as one of the bands that changed the way they thought about heavy music. Yet commercial success never arrived in the same way for the people who had written those songs. It wasn't an isolated story. Across Britain, remarkable bands found themselves caught between two worlds. Too ambitious to remain local, too early, or simply too different to become global stars. Looking back, it's tempting to sort out those stories into winners and losers. Reality is rarely that simple. Many of the musicians who seemed to disappear never really disappeared at all. Their ideas continued traveling, often farther than they could have ever imagined. Sometimes in someone else's hands. And while Britain was still trying to understand what it had created, young musicians thousands of miles away were listening very carefully. The records leaving Britain didn't stop at Britain's borders. They found their way into bedrooms, college dormitories, independent record shops, anywhere a young guitarist searched for something louder, something faster and more urgent. Across the Atlantic, a new generation listened, not simply as fans, but as students. They studied the riffs, they studied the energy and the attitude. The realization that heavy music no longer had to follow anyone else's rules.
Understanding reckon the number of the beast, for it is.
Then they had to ask a different question. What happens if we push this even further? That answer came from California.
San Francisco.
It came from New York. The American underground. Bands began taking the speed, taking the precision, and the aggression they had absorbed from Britain's underground and driving it into unfamiliar territory. The music became sharper, it became faster, more relentless. What had begun as influence became evolution. The irony was unmistakable. Many of these musicians never hid where their inspiration came from. They celebrated the British bands that had opened the door. They covered their songs. They spoke about them openly. They never claimed to have invented the sound. But history rarely follows influence as closely as it follows the success. As the new decade gathered momentum, the conversation shifted. New names filled magazine covers, new scenes demanded attention, and almost without anyone noticing, the movement that had helped unlock this future slowly drifted from the center of the story. Not because it failed, Not because it was defeated, because the story itself had grown larger than the place where it began.
James Hetfield, rhythm guitar and vocals.
Or had it.
Lars Ulrich, drums and bongs.
Dave Mustaine, lead guitar. Cliff Burton, bass guitar.
How long has the band been together as Metallica?
Well, since we started.
Which was what? October 81?
Who are your favorite artists or your main influences? Let's start with you.
Oh, I don't know. There's all kinds of shit. I can't even start to think about it. Angel Witch, Fate, Venom,
Motorhead,
Rush,
Venom.
Diamond Head, Black Sabbath, Diamond Head. ZZ Top.
Perhaps we've been asking the wrong question. Not when did the new wave of British heavy metal end, but what does it actually mean for a movement to end? Some movements don't collapse. They spread. Their ideas travel farther than the people who first imagined them. They cross borders, change hands, evolve, until eventually they no longer belong to one place at all. The evidence is everywhere. Listen closely to heavy metal over the decades that followed, and familiar echoes begin to emerge. Not exact copies, shared ideas. The twin guitar harmonies, the galloping rhythms. Melodic aggression, a willingness to keep pushing forward. The vocabulary changes, the accent changes, but the language remains recognizable. Across Europe, new scenes found their own voices. In Germany and Scandinavia, in Japan and South America. Each built something unique. None attempted to become Britain. Yet again and again, musicians pointed towards the same records.
The Iron Maiden, Motorhead, Saxon, Diamond Head, Merciful Fate, Fanatics.
Toward the same bands, the same spark.
Back then, you'd be hanging out in the record store for 2-3 hours. You only have $20 in your pocket, so you're trying to figure out which 2 records to buy. You know, it took a while.
Not as something to preserve, but as something to build upon. Influence doesn't remain frozen. It keeps moving, changing shape, finding new homes. Perhaps that's why some movements become difficult to see, not because they vanish, because they stop belonging to one movement. And maybe we've mistaken transformation for disappearance. Long after the headlines moved on, many of the people who helped build this extraordinary moment simply kept living their lives. Some continued making music, some returned to the ordinary jobs, some watched younger generations embrace ideas that once struggled to find an audience. There were no closing ceremonies, no official ending. History simply turned the page. Walk through the old photographs, the faded ticket stubs, the independent record shops that somehow survived. The club that still remembers. You'll discover something remarkable. Every famous story rests upon hundreds of quieter ones. Promoters who risked empty rooms, shop owners who stocked records no one requested, journalists who believed these bands deserved to be heard, fans who spent their last few pounds on unknown single instead of a familiar name. None expected recognition. Most never received it. Yet without them, the story unfolds very different. History usually remembers the people standing beneath the brightest lights, It rarely lingers on those who built the stage. But perhaps their reward was never fame. Perhaps it was knowing they helped create something that continued long after they had stepped away from it. Sometimes, changing the future doesn't guarantee a place inside it. The music never stopped. It simply kept moving, from city to city, from country to country, from generation to generation. Every era added something new. Every scene found its own identity. That's how living music survives. It evolves. Somewhere tonight, someone's gonna pick up a guitar for the very first time, and somewhere else, an old record is gonna slide from its sleeve. A familiar riff will spark a new idea. Another rehearsal room will fill with the noise. Another unknown band will load its equipment into the back of their van. No one in that room will be thinking about history. They'll simply be trying to make music, just as the other ones did before them.
What? The finish. We're gonna sock the finish up with metal. Yeah. We're gonna hit them hard and we're gonna have fun. Fuck yeah.
Perhaps that's enough. Not every movement needs a monument. Not every pioneer becomes a household name. Because sometimes, the greatest legacy is becoming part of the language itself. So deeply woven into the culture that people stop asking where it began.
Been together almost 30 years and still...
The stage became larger, the crowds became louder, the music traveled farther than anyone standing in those small British clubs could have imagined. Yet beneath every galloping rhythm, every soaring harmony, every young band chasing one more Friday night, the echo remains. Not as a memory, but as a beginning.